Episode 7, The Confrontation. Let me tell you something before we go on. I did not have any grand plan. I just knew the minute the law started leaning in, men like Cass would start leaning back too. And when that happens, you either find another way to move, or you stand still and lose. That shift did not come with shouting or slammed doors in the middle of the night. It came one early afternoon a couple of days later, in a place where dust hung in the air and men pretended not to hear too much. My mother had come back from town with something interesting to tell me. Cass was standing near the general store with one foot propped on the running board of his car, talking to a man who nodded more than he spoke. The paint on Cass's car caught the noon sun, and the engine ticked soft as it cooled. Crates were stacked in the rear under a canvas that suggested nothing and everything at once, the kind of covering that only fools mistake for innocence. Eli came from the courthouse side of the square, hat set, badge visible, and a hard look on his face. He walked slowly, letting his presence be seen before his words were heard, and that mattered in a town like ours. When a lawman walks up in public, he is not only talking to one man, he is talking to everybody watching from behind glass, and feed sacks and polite smiles. Cass noticed him and straightened a fraction, not in deference, but in awareness, the way a man adjusts when he realizes the wind changes. Eli offered a plain greeting and stopped a polite distance away from Cass. Cass answered with a humble hello and nothing more. The man who had been talking with Cass drifted off with practiced discretion, leaving those two in open view of anyone who cared to look. Storefront windows reflected them faintly, doubling the image of law and enterprise facing one another under a sky that offered no shade. Mama said she couldn't hear everything said, but I heard more later in pieces, the way things travel in all small towns. Eli told Cass the sheriff was hearing more noise than he liked, folks talking out in Baden about his lack of control in his county, church members angry with the lack of the law's response. His voice stayed even, almost conversational, the way a man talks when he is trying to keep something from turning into a public quarrel. Cass answered that folks talked when they were bored, and church was always restless about some devil or the other. Eli did not accuse him, and he did not ask direct questions. He told him patrol was heavier on the back roads. Mama said that Cass's expression did not change at first, but looked something behind it recalculated things. He must have known more patrols meant more headlights where there had been darkness, more tires on gravel where silence had been protection. Cass's eyes flicked once toward the road out of town and then back to Eli, and that one flick would have told me plenty if I had been there to see it. Cass asked if Eli was telling him something. Eli said he was telling him what he knew, and that he expected Cass to be as forthcoming as he had just been. He said the sheriff wanted to know something if there was something to know about illegal liquor being made here, and if Cass heard or knew anything to let him know. Eli was not a man who bluffed for sport, and everyone in town, including Cass, knew that. Cass told Eli he appreciated the information. Eli left without saying anything further. That is what folks forget about the law. Sometimes it is not the raid that breaks you. Sometimes it is the warning delivered in public. So everybody knows it was delivered, and nobody can later claim surprise. Cass stood where he was a few seconds after Eli left. The only sound close by was that tick of his cooling engine. He lifted the canvas edge and let it fall back, like he was checking that everything was still where he left it, and then he climbed into the car. He drove out of town slower than usual, dust trailing behind him in a thin ribbon. Mama thought he must have been heading to the barn. She was right. While that confrontation was happening in town, I was in the barn checking the seals on one of the barrels and finishing up my new ritual of putting things away. I saw Cass pulling up the drive as I stepped into the doorway, wiping my hands on a cloth, mash and cooling copper clinging to my sleeves, the way guilt clings when you do not invite it. I told him he was early. Tonight the latest jars would be ready to go out. Cass leaned against the car door and crossed his arms loose like he had come to talk, not to work. He said he was not running that night, and the words hit the barn air and stayed there. I asked him why. Cass told me patrol was heavier, sheriff had put more tires on the road, and it not worth the risk with the heat increasing. I watched his face more than his posture. His jaw was set, and his eyes kept shifting toward the road and back, like his mind was already mapping where trouble might come from, and I could hear fear in his voice. A week ago, he would have talked about demand increasing and how it was easy money. Now he was talking about risk, and risk makes every profit look smaller. I told him Stanley was still open because I knew what roads he drove and what county lines meant to men who made their living in the dark. Cass let out a faint exhale that was close to amusement and told me heat traveled. Cabarrus got loud and Stanley listened. I reminded him Stanley was not Cabarrus. I told him he had driven farther for less, and I said it steady because I was trying to keep my own urgency from turning into pleading. The barn held a faint echo of our voices. Barrels stood behind me like witnesses in the dimness, sealed and patient, doing their work, not caring if we argued or not. The copper was disassembled and tucked away, invisible unless you knew what to look for. And I was glad of it, because the last thing I needed was Cass's eyes landing on something shiny and deciding he was tired of reliance on a girl. Cass said he did not gamble when the table was crowded, and he told me we would move it in a day or two. When he said that, I felt the number in my mind tighten like a rope pulled one notch shorter. A day or two was not empty time. It was mash turning, barrels waiting, and interest accumulating in a courthouse ledger that did not pause for patrol patterns. It was also Cass's promise, and I had already learned a promise is only as strong as the road between here and town. I told him some money was better than none. Cass told me none was better than losing the whole lot, and he said it like a man who believed fear was a form of wisdom. The exchange stayed calm, almost courteous, but something shifted underneath it. I heard caution in his voice where I had come to expect nerve, and I understood his risk as well as he did. Still, I also understood that distance does not shrink by waiting, and you cannot bargain with a deadline by asking it to be patient. I told him he was the one with the car and the roots. Cass's eyes sharpened to narrow slits, and he said he would be the one who answered if they caught him with it. I told him I was the one who lost if we did not move it, and that was the first time the words came out plain between us. It was not a threat. It was the truth set down where he could see it, like laying a nickel on a counter. Silence stretched and the tension tightened. A breeze moved through the barn door seam, carrying pine and warm earth smells that mixed with smell of burnt oak and warm copper. Backlash shifted in the pasture and flicked his tail like trouble was only a fly. Cass said we would run when it cooled, but not that night. He did not ask my agreement. He assumed it, and that assumption settled wrong, because it reminded me what I was to him when the roads got dangerous. I was supply, and he was the one with the wheels that moved it. I told him all right, and I kept my voice neutral enough to hide the calculation that had started moving behind my eyes. Cass nodded once and got back in his car. Gravel cracked under tires as he reversed and turned toward the road. I watched as the dust rose and settled quicker than before, leaving me alone with the quiet again. It felt like nothing had changed, and at the same time, everything had. I stood in the barn doorway after the engine sound faded. Inside, the finished jars from the last run cooled under burlap. I stepped back inside and pulled the burlap aside and lifted one jar to feel its weight. Clear liquid inside caught the late light, and the glass still warm felt heavy my palm. I thought to myself the jar did not care who hauled it. It only cared that it stayed upright and unbroken, and I took that as a kind of instruction of what needed to be done. I thought 4 jars would be manageable on horseback, 2 in each saddlebag. 4 jars would not draw attention the way a crate in a car might, and 4 jars would bring in enough to matter, without looking like greed. I did not need greed. I needed movement, and I needed it in the same way you need water when the well starts running dry. I set the jar down and leaned against the plank, thinking about the narrow cut I had ridden since I was a girl. Backlash knew every turn, every low branch, and shallow dip. He could move that path faster than any car could follow, without breaking axle or nerve. And he could do it quiet on pine needles, where a motor always announced itself. Cass had chosen caution, and I did not mistake caution for cowardice entirely, but I felt its edge against my urgency. I knew he could have crossed into Stanley if he wanted the money bad enough. I had heard stories of his late-night drives and quiet exchanges beyond county lines, and I knew a man's courage often depended on what he stood to gain and what he stood to lose. The jars waited, but I knew the courthouse steps did not. I could see it in my mind like it was written on paper again. That courthouse hand, that deadline that did not care whether patrol was heavier this week. That was what settled it for me. Not pride, not spite, just the plain understanding that if I let other people's fear set my pace, I would end up watching Granny's land slide away while I stayed obedient to something that didn't care about any of it. I reached for the saddlebags hanging on their peg and brought them down, checking straps for wear the way you check a rope before you trust it with weight. I moved without haste, each action deliberate, like the decision had been waiting quietly for permission to surface. Outside, the light softened toward dusk, and the sky shaded from pale gold toward a deeper tone that promised concealment as much as risk. I could hear evening settle into the trees, insects starting up, birds calling once, and then going quiet again. Backlash lifted his head when I approached with the saddle. His ears pricked forward in question, not alarm. I could feel he knew the difference between fear and work. "Just a short ride," I told him. I said it the way you mean things when you are trying to make them true. The barn stood open behind me, barrels sealed and copper hidden with care. I carried 4 jars from the plank and wrapped each in cloth before placing 2 into each saddlebag. I adjusted the balance until the weight felt centered and steady, because if you are going to gamble on movement, you do not start sloppy. I tested the straps twice and listened for any clink, because glass talks loud in the wrong moment. Some money was better than none, and I did not have the luxury of waiting for Cass to grow brave again. I swung into the saddle and turned Backlash toward the narrow cut that led away from the house and into the trees, letting the first steps be easy and quiet. The pines were already darkening at the edges, and the path ahead looked like its own kind of promise, the same one it had offered me when I was young and thought speed could keep trouble from catching me.